This is Dr. Lisa Marie Bobby, and you're listening to the Love, Happiness, and Success podcast.
We've got the former, but not the latter. Hey, in the end,
That's the song Love and Money by the band Blue in the Face. On today's episode of the podcast, we are covering a topic that so many couples have dealt with at some point in their relationships, and that is financial infidelity. This is not something that is often talked about, but it is a very real situation in the lives of many couples. Financial infidelity is a situation where one partner has lied to the other about money, perhaps concealing debt, omitting financial information, things that their partner really should know. And it can create a lot of mistrust, betrayal, hurt, anger in a relationship when this happens. And many couples really need guidance to figure out how to mend this very unique kind of betrayal and ideally prevent it from happening in the first place or certainly in the future. So to give you some guidance and a good roadmap for what to do if you are dealing with this situation, I have invited my dear friend and colleague, Megan Terry, to join us on the show today. Megan is a highly experienced marriage and family therapist on our team here at Growing Self. She is an MFT supervisor and trains early career counselors, among other things. And she is also trained in financial counseling for couples by the Federal Reserve. She's a true expert on this subject, and she's here today to share her wisdom with you. So thank you, Megan, for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited we can have this conversation together.
Well, it's an important conversation because this is common and there are not many good resources for couples who are dealing with this. So
it is really common and also unique, which is why I think those resources aren't out there. Whereas I think we could probably find book after book on sexual infidelity, but not financial infidelity. And it is interesting because I was looking at some stats before we started talking today, and it was something like over 30% of couples admit that this has been something that's happened in their relationship. And I would guess that many more have experienced it.
Wow. Well, let's just start at the beginning. So obviously, many of our listeners are intimately familiar with the experience of financial infidelity, but to both kind of honor and illuminate what they might be going through and create awareness about this topic for others who haven't lived through it themselves, how would you describe financial infidelity and what are the forms that you have seen it take? So in your work with couples over the years?
You know, there's a real spectrum of it. I think that it can be as small of a single transaction of maybe purchasing something when you're out shopping and withholding that from your partner and not telling them maybe what you bought or how much it was, to significant, profound impacts like taking out large sums of money in loans in a marriage, and those loans being in a partner's name and having a profound long-term impact on somebody's, finances for the rest of their lives. So it ranges. And I think that it all stems from this idea of betrayal. And when it comes to finances, I always say nobody sits us down in school and says, this is how you talk about money. It's such a rare time to have that education of not just like, what do you do with your money, but this is how you can have a healthy relationship with your partner and talk about money. Like I've never met anybody who had that experience in their life. No.
I didn't.
Neither did I.
We either fight about money or we don't talk about it at all, Megan. There's only two options right there.
Right. Could there be a healthy way? I think there is. And so I think that that's what's really led people to struggle so much because they haven't had this safe platform of talking about what's normal, what's okay. How is it normal to feel like I'm afraid to tell my partner something about what I'm spending? And how can we, give them a space to do that openly?
Well, this is kind of going into that next question that I had for you. I mean, so financial infidelity can take many forms. It feels like concealment. It feels like betrayal. But where does it come from? Are you saying that sort of the root of this is people just simply not knowing how to have overt conversations about money? Or and maybe there are a number of reasons why these outcomes can come into being, but where do you think it comes from?
My guess is a majority of the smaller infidelities are coming from an inability and a lack of knowledge of how to talk about it. How do we build trust? How do we start our relationship from the beginning? When we're in a long-term committed relationship, how do we talk about it if we're different, right? If we are the same, it's a lot easier. But if we're different, what do we do? And I think on the other end of the spectrum, when we have more serious things happening, there's a lot of power dynamics. Who has the power in the relationship? What does that mean? How does that impact decisions around money? And also privilege comes into play as well. How much privilege is one person compared to another bringing into a relationship? And how does that privilege impact their access to money? And how can that impact the couple's ability to come together and talk about their needs?
That is so interesting. Can we just dig into because there's a communication piece. Certainly there are differences that are very real we should talk about, but I was not expecting you to talk about power and privilege. Can you give us some examples of what this can look like and how you've seen this come up as part of the cause of financial infidelity?
I often think financial literacy and understanding money, budgeting and access to money is a privilege. And so
a class thing?
Absolutely. And so if you have access to understanding those things and knowing those things, you're more financially literate. And if you have a partner who hasn't had that experience and isn't able to understand that can cause a real impact in your ability to come together and make some decisions and feel like there's equity in the relationship around decision making. And so there's a power differential there.
So you're saying that some people, by virtue of their life experience or maybe their family of origin, come into a relationship with a different understanding of financial literacy, how money works, how you manage it. And if their other partner maybe comes from a different class background or family background or circumstantial background, and they don't know the same things, it creates a power differential, a privilege differential around money. Is that it?
Yeah.
Wow. That's interesting. Because I could see how that could very quickly turn into that emotional dynamic that we're both so familiar with, where one person has a spreadsheet and a lot of very well-developed ideas about what we should or shouldn't be doing with our money. And the other person is stop trying to control me. Is that where that comes from?
It absolutely can. And it can also just look like having different values because of different experiences with money growing up. And there's nothing wrong with those differences in values. They're very important, and they can often provide a couple with a wide breadth of understanding of how to look at decisions and what to do. But because of different values around maybe having things feels very important for someone, or having a full bank account feels very important to someone else. Those are different values, and those can come from different experiences with money and different privileges that they've experienced as well. And so that can create some friction in the relationship.
Yeah, just those fundamental value-based ideas around what is the purpose of money? I mean, basic kinds of. So interesting.
So there's a lot of different things that I think can really cause what lands a couple in a place where they are uncovering financial infidelity in the relationship. And you can, part of addressing that is typically going back in time and being able to say, okay, maybe we're uncovering a betrayal here and how money has been spent, or maybe hiding a credit card or doing something that is withheld from the other partner. So there's that breach, that betrayal. But we don't just look at that in just that incident. We have to go way back in the relationship and understand, what has trust looked like? What are their backgrounds around money? What are their values associated with that money? What motivated some of this hiding in the relationship? Was it self-preservation? Was it a need for independence? How are they looking at this in the relationship? And then we can usually start to understand what impact this is going to have on the couple and how they can start to navigate through the experience.
So you're saying that it really requires a sort of like peeling that onion of going back and trying to compassionately understand what was the motivation, what was like the function of the financial infidelity, the hiding of the whatever it was, and that can look different for different people. And in your experience, are there kind of common themes? Like, what are the usual suspects? Is it somebody feeling
controlled? That's a very common scenario I see, where maybe one partner has a lot of anxiety or maybe more controlling behaviors. And that's coming from a need to have some stability and, consistency of value of maybe needing to save or have certain ways that they're spending money, which is very understandable, but that's coming across to their partner as they're being controlled or restricted or parented, or like they can't make their own decisions. And so oftentimes that leads to some hiding or withdrawing and pulling out loans or credit cards to, feel some of that independence. This is probably the most common scenario I've seen.
I could see that. And I think I'm glad you're talking about this, because I think anytime we use the word infidelity, it can be very easy to immediately sort of vilify the partner who has done the betrayal and create a very like negative narrative. And certainly like, you're responsible for your behavior no matter what the circumstances.
Absolutely.
We all have choices. But at the same time, I like the way you're illuminating kind of the systemic nature of that what the couple is sort of creating together is this perception of power and control that the partner who winds up engaging in like hiding behaviors feels like they can't talk to their partner directly. Their priorities or needs or feelings aren't honored or valued. So they have to like go around them to get their needs met because they can't feel heard and understood directly.
Yeah. And Lisa, as you're saying that, I just think of that couple and how they must feel so disconnected and how they are really looking at trust in the relationship. And they're saying, can I trust you to each other? Can I trust you to trust me to spend money in an appropriate way? Can I trust you to not be controlling, right? How can we help that couple come together so that they can see that they have a committed relationship and they're devoted? And what are things that they can align on so that they can have that emotional intimacy back in the relationship? Because anytime there is that betrayal or that withholding, that couple's being pulled apart, they're disconnected in that experience.
Well, and I think that I'm guessing that must be one of like the biggest fears that you would have to deal with in the beginning of that work is like, okay, so you were lying to me or concealing things about money. What else are you potentially hiding? Or like it just calls into question many different facets of trust. Or is it different? Is it usually sort of more localized into just financial mistrust?
In my experience, I've really only seen it in finances specifically, though I'm sure there are outliers. And it's similar to sexual infidelity, and where oftentimes more can come out as it's discussed, right? Which is very difficult, right? Because it's like, oh yes, there was this one purchase, but oh yeah, then there were these others too. And then there were, oh, maybe there was this credit, and it can really build. So that's part of, it can be re-traumatizing in that way for the couple to have to relive some of that coming out. And then in other cases, it's more benign. And a misalignment and differences. What I notice is it's very preventable if a couple is able to sit down and say, okay, we have to talk about money. We know that this is going to be a part of our relationship. There's no way to live in this world if it's not. And start to have upfront discussions about their financial situation once they're in that long-term committed relationship, about money, budgets, goals, dreams, their values. How do they make decisions? What are their habits with money? And that way, when they're starting out having some of those conversations, they're starting to build that trust. They're going back to that, ability to turn towards one another, as Gottman says, as opposed to turning away, and opening up and being able to show each other, here's who I am. This is what I come from. Can we talk about it? Transparency is one of the most important things when it comes to money and building that trust as a couple. And so being able to give them that opportunity right from the beginning to talk about it helps build that. The longer it goes on, the more damage it does to the relationship.
For sure. Well, and I can't help but thinking of your work right now. I know that you have done a ton of premarital counseling, and you taught our Lifetime of Love premarital class. And are these topics that couples, well, I know when they do premarital counseling with you or anybody on our team, they will be talking about money, but like, how many couples actually get to do this work or even know that this is a thing worth doing in the beginning of the relationship? Or in your experience, do most couples just kind of raise their hand and like, I think we need to talk about money after they have run into trouble several years later?
I think I think couples are getting a little bit more savvy lately. And I think they often think they're talking about it, but they're not.
What do you mean?
They're not talking about their values and how they plan to spend their money. Or how their habits around it and how those habits grew out of experiences they had in their childhood or what their families did. They're talking about, this is how much money I have in my bank account, and this is how much I like to save every month, and kind of there, right? And that's important. That's a good start. And that's going to help you build some good habits as a couple. But when you're committing to a relationship for the long term, having discussions around where you see things going in your future. What would you do if somebody withheld money? Why would that ever occur? What do you need to talk about to make sure it doesn't occur in the relationship is really important. And those values and that background that you have growing up make a huge impact in those discussions. I've noticed a lot of couples will come in and say, oh yeah, we talk about money. And then I say, oh, so you've talked about your childhood and the positive memories you have and the negative memories. And they often say, oh no, we didn't talk about that. We just talked about what's in our bank account right now.
But I mean, that makes so much sense though. I mean, what you were saying at the very beginning of our conversation is that we are not socialized to talk about money or understand our relationship with money, the meaning of money, the values we have around money. It's like there's just this sort of blank spot in everybody's awareness in a lot of ways. And so how could you possibly, without some support, like be communicating that understanding of yourself to your partner when maybe you don't even know? It's just sort of this like subconscious broth we're sort of simmering in. And I could see how it's so fundamentally important to not just understand yourself, but understand your partner, because as you also said in the beginning, people have very real differences about those things. And I think it's very easy too to kind of even subconsciously judge other people's values, practices, orientation towards money.
Yeah.
If it's different from our own.
Well, yeah. And for partners to feel like they're less than their partner who maybe had more privilege and has more financial literacy or understanding around money, when there's nothing wrong. They're not less than. They didn't have the same experiences. They didn't have the privilege of having some of that literacy or education brought to them. Yeah. And so oftentimes when we can talk about that openly and build some of that equity and connection in the relationship, it feels like a really secure attachment for both partners. And they feel like they can really move forward together. But I think that it can build a lot of different feelings for both partners.
Yeah. Wow.
I often think about it like, we have a culture of avoidance when talking about sex. I think we also have a big culture of avoidance talking about money. And those are two big betrayals that happen in relationships.
Definitely. Well, there's a lot of shame, I think, around money or like secrecy. Yeah. Both ways. Like there's shame if you feel like you don't have enough money, but there's also like secrecy if you come from a privileged background where it's like it's nobody's business how much money I make.
Same as sex, shame and avoidance, been a big part of our culture. And I think about Brene Brown, who says, how do we deal with shame, right? We have to squash it, right? We have to talk about it. We have to put it out there. Muffin. Yes. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned that couples will often have differences in a relationship as it relates to money. And that as a result of those differences kind of not being known or understood at the get-go, a couple that does not have the privilege of coming to visit with you for premarital counseling or doing some marriage prep work that specifically addresses the deeper issues of finances. What would you say are some early warning signs that you might be in a relationship dynamic that could be vulnerable to financial infidelity, or that it could even be happening or starting to happen? What would you say are some of the ways that can look early on before it gets...
Small ways of being afraid to tell a partner about a purchase. I've noticed that there are sometimes differences around where excess funds should go. So, for example, during the pandemic, student loans payments were halted. And, I remember talking with a couple about where should that money go? Do you have to keep paying, or should we put it into savings, or should you maybe go buy that new bag or shoes that they were really wanting? There can be real differences around where that money should go and where that lies in terms of values. And when that conflict really lands at an impasse, or there starts to be feelings of resentment or anger around how a partner's making decisions with their money, then absolutely there needs to be some support for that partner. And sometimes there can be, I think, incompatibilities where if somebody has very strong values around how much debt or lack of debt or anything, and then somebody else really believes in, spending more, having more debt, but in certain ways of feeling stable within that probably is going to be a really big red flag and something that is very difficult for that couple to ever navigate through.
Really? Well, and so let's just, with that for a sec, I think even people who are fundamentally very similar in some ways, there are always differences within a relationship. Somebody who's a little bit more of a spender, a little bit more of a saver. But you're saying that when that gap is too big, that sometimes there is not actually the opportunity to build a bridge to the center. It's just sort of something that needs to be recognized. And is that what you're saying?
Yeah, if it's a significant gap, it's going to be something that is a pervasive issue in the relationship that's going to probably feel like consistent betrayals. So that would be very hard, I think, for a couple to navigate. There's never going to be a couple that's perfectly aligned on every level.
Sure.
And we know that all couples have perpetual issues. And so there is always going to be degrees of difference within this. And that's good. Like I said before, I think some differences in values give this breadth to a couple of creativity and their ability to make decisions. But when that gap is really different, I would be concerned about how they're going to be able to bridge that.
Well, and I could see especially with money, because I think if the values are very different, it starts to impact one's vision for one's life. If it's retirement savings or being able to do certain things later in life versus being able to have a life worth living for maybe somebody who feels better with spending more as they go, I could see that really starting to take a toll.
Yeah, and those tangible moments, those big life moments. That's why a lot of the conversations we have are, what are your hopes, goals, and dreams? What is important to you? Now, if somebody has a hope to have, a big house and nice cars, and another partner says, well, I could go for that, but it's just not my big dream. Then we talk about what that difference is and what would it mean and what would you have to do to achieve that together as a couple? What sacrifices are they willing to make or not willing to make in that process? Oftentimes a couple tends to align with each other really well on those. And those are fun conversations. Couples love to talk about their dreams and their goals together.
We both want to quit our jobs and live in an RV for a year. And all right. So to bring this kind of background, I think this has been a really good conversation about just some of those basic pillars of having a healthy financial relationship with your partner. But let's just talk for a second about, the situation that I know is all too familiar in your practice where, you get a call from a couple who has just, a financial betrayal, feels like it just blew a hole in the waterline of their relationship. And it feels like a crisis. And it's all this stuff is coming out. For people who might be listening to this podcast who have experienced that or who are currently going through it, can you give us some insight or recommendations for how to even think about trying to repair this or maybe even situations where it's actually not reparable?
Well, and thinking to try and repair it, the first step is you're going to need help. You're going to need somebody to sit there with you and help you sift through that. And there's a process to that. There's ways that we can help understand what happened, why it happened, and what we need to do to start to heal and repair if they're ready to do that and want to move in that direction. If it's been an irreparable harm and is on that other end of the spectrum, that's very damaging with long-term impacts, and typically a couple, isn't working in our office at that point, true. And they are working in other places. And then there's a lot of damage control because there's the infidelity with finances has a long-term impact on somebody's life. And when you're married, that's shared. And so typically that debt isn't just impacting one person, it's impacting the whole family.
How enraging to be cleaning up that mess, even if you do decide to end the relationship, that it's still your problem for a long time. It's just enraging.
And that goes back to that powerlessness and that just devastating experience. And so we, that person who's trying to, there's a lot of support for them, I think emotionally, taking care of their mental health. And trying to take it a step at a time to try and pull themselves out of that so they can get stable again. Yeah.
That's good advice. Well, and I'm also glad that you brought up an important point, which is that with any kind of infidelity, be it sexual infidelity, emotional infidelity, it is extraordinarily difficult. I would even say impossible for couples to figure that out without some kind of support because the emotions are so intense and they will destroy the type of work that is needed to to repair a relationship unless you're working with somebody who can help you manage those. And as you say, kind of crack into, anger is such a big part of this. How can you have emotionally intimate, vulnerable conversations when you're in that, how could you have done that kind of space? And so just to recognize that. So given that this is, you really need professional help, what advice then would you give to a couple who is trying to figure out where to look for help? Because I know you and I both know that it can be very difficult to find appropriate help for even relatively basic things. Something that you and I often talk about is the fact that most counselors seeing couples for garden variety relational stuff do not have specialized training or experience or expertise in working with couples. And that can create really non-ideal outcomes. So I think the general public doesn't even understand that if they want to work on their relationship, they should work with an MFT who is, has specialized training in the modalities that we know works. Because most of the time, somebody will show up in the office of a licensed clinical social worker thinking that they're there for couples counseling, and they'll be told to go on a date night or whatever. And they, it doesn't help. And then they think that couples counseling has failed and their relationship is irredeemable. And they genuinely don't know that they didn't know enough to go to a qualified professional. And I think that's a real dark part of our field in general. And so what we're talking about today, though, Megan, is an even more specialized facet of couples counseling that I know we work with a lot of MFTs in our practice here at Growing Self. And I know that you have so graciously conducted a number of trainings for our group on the subject of financial counseling for couples, because it's something that you know so much about. But I know for a lot of people, even in our group, is going through these internal trainings is really the first time that they've gotten specialized training and experience around financial counseling for couples. So and I just wanted to bring that up because I think that there is somebody dealing with a situation, they need help, but where would you even look? Are there things to ask?
The other day I was asked, who should I go see for, my husband and I are struggling. Who should we go look for? Right. And I said, you always want to look for a systemic therapist. And they're like, what is that? And when we think about infidelity, financial infidelity, like we've been talking about, Lisa, this is a systemic issue in a relationship. This isn't in a vacuum. This goes back to values. This goes back to identity. This goes back to financial implications, the family, it's trust, loyalty. What does the commitment mean? So you have to work with someone. I would say step one is find a systemic therapist. And a systemic therapist is a licensed marriage and family therapist, somebody who's trained in that systems thinking. Yeah. And then also look for somebody who actually has experience working with couples and talking about money. They need to have that comfort with talking about money, being able to ask these questions about money, and know that it is a longer process, that it is not something that is going to be resolved within 6 sessions. This is something that takes a while to address. And, that reminds me that many couples who are talking about money need to talk about it throughout their relationship. It's not just that premarital time. It's about values change throughout our lives, and we shift just like income changes throughout our lives often. So how can we continue to have that conversation? It takes a really long time to understand that and continue to build that trust as a couple, just as it would going through the therapy process to address any betrayals or infidelities that have occurred. It's going to take a while.
Yeah. So to be looking for an MFT, that systems-minded person, somebody who is competent and comfortable and experienced and working with couples around financial aspects. But also I want to highlight what you're saying, but I think you didn't say this out loud, but it's on a very deep level is where we need to go to really create healing and growth and change in a financial relationship. Because I think that even some, coming out with my air quotes again, the financial people, their answers, in my experience, tend to be quite behavioral. We need to create a budget. We need to create separate checking accounts. There are like very specific do's and don'ts related to financial practices. And I did not hear you talk about any of that in our conversation today.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with that. And more to do with respect, loyalty, and emotional intimacy in a relationship, and how to repair those so that the fidelity in the relationship is strong. And sometimes through that process for a couple, it is being able to build evidence of trust. And so a partner may ask to see bank accounts, may want to track spending so that they can feel that trust build and have evidence of those behaviors. But building a budget with a couple is not going to address a financial infidelity. No, it's going to leave them feeling confused and like the deep pain of the betrayal isn't being addressed in the ways that they need to heal.
Yeah. I'm so glad we're talking about this, because I think people need to hear this important message from you, because we just don't talk about this enough. And so many couples are struggling with it. And like, if you go see a financial planner, they'll be like, okay, let's bring in 3 months of expenses and let's build a budget. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So before I let you go, this has been such a wonderful conversation. So I hear that like at the beginning of a relationship, it's important to have very like deep, meaningful conversations. There is a path of repair many times when things are starting to go sideways, and that financial infidelity is really a symptom of many things, but fundamentally a lack of alignment, emotional safety, understanding of each other, and that there is a path to repairing that. And just, can you say a little bit more about, in your experience, when couples are engaging in healthy ways with each other around financial practices, matters, their financial life, what does that look like in your experience when a couple is actually doing this well?
There is transparency through, they know their finances, they know what's happening with their money and where it's being spent.
Like, are they sitting down with each other and like looking at finances together periodically? Like what?
So typically it starts off with maybe a bigger conversation early in the relationship about, here's my money situation. Here's my credit report. I always encourage couples to print out your credit reports. Just show your, it's such a hot date, right? Like what a test. Yeah. All right. But it just, put your chips on the table, right? Like, let's not hide anything, because if we are hiding, it's going to come out. It always does. Yeah. And so can you do that? And then we do like money meetings. And how do we have a money meeting consistently to the point where we feel like we're completely on the same page? And then you space them out. Sometimes couples are doing these weekly. Sometimes they're doing them monthly. And then after a while, they feel like that trust has been built. They are in such sync with each other. They know what their spending is. Their habits have been established. The trust is strong there. There's consistent communication around money, but it's maybe not as structured as that money meeting. And those couples are able to say, oh, okay, great. We've, met our goals. And those goals can be a variety of different things for couples. They're always different. There's not one specific set that needs to happen. And they feel freedom and trust and closeness in the relationship because they've been able to establish that. So there's those conversations in the beginning, money meetings to establish it, following through on behavior, supporting each other, coming to each other when mistakes are made, because those happen when you forget to pay a bill or when the credit card expired and whatever, and talking through those things. And having that established trust with one another. It feels really good.
That's wonderful. And I'll also share, there was another idea that you shared with our team when you did a training on this topic that I actually took to heart personally, because you were talking about the importance of both people in a relationship having access and like knowing where all the stuff is, knowing where all the passwords are, knowing how to like do different things. And I think it's very easy in a long-term relationship for one person to just sort of naturally take on more of those tasks. And that really resonated with me because I'm more of that person in my own marriage. And it was actually after that, like, wow, if something happened to me, would Matt know where to, like, even the logins and the passwords and what's happening? And I really appreciated that. And we haven't done this. I will take your great advice at some point, but you recommended even like switching off sometimes, like who's in charge of doing the things, like letting your partner manage the practical stuff. I'm working on that part, Megan.
We all are, right? It's such a great thing to do. And it's such a good exercise for both people because one partner takes the first 6 months in the year and then the other partner takes the other 6 months of the year. And it's a long enough period of time where they're really getting a deep understanding of where are all the bills, what's happening with our retirement accounts, how do we do direct deposit, any of those things and stuff that always comes up for couples throughout that time. Like, oh no, the refrigerator broke. We have to get a new one. How do we pay for that? And talking about that with each other. That doesn't mean the other partner doesn't know what's going on.
Yeah.
They know everything. There's still all of that communication, but they then switch. And it's a real tragedy when we have a client who comes in and they were unaware of what's happening and maybe something happened to their partner and they don't know where the bank accounts are and they don't know where to access things or pay the mortgage. And they're already dealing with enough stress in that moment to have to deal with that too. So it's really important to be able to have those roles switched and that one person isn't always in charge of it. And that is something that we work towards when we're dealing with infidelity. How do we get to the place where we feel confident enough to switch those roles?
I could see that being a big victory for couples that have been on this path when they feel comfortable. Well, I'm sure that there's always some apprehension, but that like trust of being able to hand this over, you tell me how we're doing with our finances. Like I would imagine in your role when that shift happens, you think, I think our work here is done.
There's quite a bit of celebrating. Yes.
So that's good. What a great conversation. Thank you so much, Megan, just for talking about this very sensitive topic with me today and just providing so much of your wisdom and experience, both with our practice, but also with our listeners today on the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I always love talking with you.
And he hung out with boozers. We say that love is all we need, then